Good evening. Thank you very much for coming along. For those who don't know, my name is Jonathan Michie. I'm the college president, so welcome to Kellogg College, for those of you who haven't been here before. And I'm particularly pleased to be the co-editor of this book, Why the Social Sciences Matter. This is a second edition. The first edition was 10 years ago when I was on the council of the Academy of Social Sciences. And I'll start off by giving an apology from Will Hutton, who's not able to get here. You may have seen he was supposed to be the fifth chair. To be fair to Will, when we invited him, he said he wouldn't be able to make this day because it's budget day. So could we move the event, because he'd have to work in London writing about the budget for the Observer. Some of you might have seen he centre page spreads for the last few Sundays on the road towards the budget. But being Will said he'd try and write quickly and dash up. But he just phoned to say he's still there writing his 1,000-word piece on the budget. So he sends his apologies, but we'll try to get him some other time. He's president of the Academy of Social Sciences. I think it's funny because it may come up in some of the remarks and questions from you, the fact that governments the world over, but I think the British government, as always, tends to be particularly bad, tend to take a very narrow view of the academic subjects that should be taught, and tend to say that maths, engineering, science, medicine are the key things everyone should be educated in. And yet when you look at what the government seems to think is their most important day of the year, it's the budget, on how they're going to run the economy. And then the reporting of the budget and how they're going to run the economy is actually all focused on the politics of it. And then the analysis is largely focused on the societal impacts on inequality and the like. So I think that begins to already make the case that you do need to look at all these subjects. I've asked each of the four speakers to introduce themselves, because they'll have a far better idea than I do about what they think is relevant to the discussion. But they're going to speak in turn, the order they're sitting in, and then once all four of them have had the chance to make their introductory remarks, then we'll throw it open for questions and general discussion. So first, Professor Iole Solanke holds the University of Oxford's statutory chair in European Union law. Iole is the Jacques Delors Professor of European Union law, and I don't know what she's going to say now, but as you'll see, that her chapter in the book is on decolonial theory and the European Commission, diversity, conviviality, and cognitive justice. So, Iole.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the book, and also to participate in this event here this evening. So, as Jonathan said, I'm the professor in European Union law. I'm a fellow of Somerville College, which is very close to here, and I'm also the director of the Institute for European and Comparative Law in the Faculty of Law. And I also work with students who are interested in European Union law and also decolonising the law. So since joining Oxford around 4 years ago, the majority of my work has been not only in those two areas, but in trying to bridge them together. And it's very interesting. Today we had a meeting of our decolonising law discussion group, and Tracy Robinson was our speaker, who I gather is a fellow of Kellogg College. So as was said, my paper is about decolonial theory and diversity in the European Commission. One of the things that I'm trying to do in my work is to encourage the European Union and my colleagues across the European Union to think about diversity beyond gender. And I've started to use decolonial theory as a way to do that. So that's really what I'm doing in this piece. I introduced decolonial theory as a way to take a thicker approach to diversity that doesn't just focus on gender. Now, that's challenging in the European context because most countries don't even like talking about race. So it's a slow process to encourage thinking in this direction. In my paper, I highlight Eurocentrism, not only in the European institutions themselves, not just the Commission, but the Court of Justice and the Parliament, but also in the rules that are created by the European Commission and the European Parliament. In the paper, I talk about three manifestations of coloniality. First of all, as I've said, in the composition of the institutions themselves, specifically the European Commission that was just appointed this year, which, yes, has many women, and of course the head honcho herself is female, but there aren't, and there have never been, any racially minoritized men or women in the European Commission, or indeed in any of the other institutions. So that's one manifestation I talk about. But then I also talk about European Union laws, in particular the new Pact on Migration and Asylum, which has many problems, but one of the things it does is introduce collection of biometric data, not just for adults, but for children from the age of 6. So I say, well, this harkens back to the ways in which adults and children were marked during the enslavement period. And then I talk about the treatment of African students who were fleeing from Ukraine when war broke out there, and the way in which they were treated by border guards as criminals, as illegitimate refugees, and as people who needed to be detained, held up at gunpoint, and not treated with the same care and concern as white migrants. So I talk about coloniality in the social imaginary of across Europe. And then I go on to talk about the intellectual environment of European Union law, the environment that it is created in, the environment that we teach it in, and those who teach it. I talk about the canon in European Union law, and I use the Miranda Fricker's idea of epistemic injustice, and I talk about Ndlovu Sabello's idea of cognitive justice as a corrective to epistemic injustice. Cognitive justice promoting a non-zero-sum approach to knowledge production and rationality. And I say a little bit about how this can be used in European Union law. So that's my contribution to trying to encourage us and our students to take social sciences seriously and to use social sciences creatively in order to think differently about the world, in particular the European Union. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I should have said one of the reasons we were keen to get the date for the book launch today and get the book produced in time was so that it would solve all my personal quandaries about what to get everyone, all my family members for Christmas. So we have got copies of the book available at the back, and in fact tonight the publishers are giving a 20% discount because of the book launch tonight, so it's only £19.99, so you can solve all your Christmas presents and get the signatures of various of the authors. Next speaker, Robin Cohen's Emeritus Professor of Development Studies, and for years has been a leading authority on migration. Again, I'll leave it to him to introduce himself, but his piece in the book, his chapter in the book, I thought was a very apt title, because it's on migration, but he chose a subtitle between global realities and political theatre. In a way, I think that sums up, again, why the world, needs social sciences, because everybody wants to know about the global realities, but the trouble is all you see is the political theatre. And Robin does a great job in unpacking the relation between the two. So, Robin.
Well, thanks, Jonathan, for the introduction. I'll say no more other than that I'm a senior research fellow here and have, over the years, done various things on international migration. So, turning to the subject itself, curiously, although there's a lot of migration from rural to urban areas and lots of internal displaced people, curiously, the number and volume of international migration is not as great as many believe. Historically, it's roughly about 3%, as measured by the number of people who are foreign born. And slowly over the last 10 years or so, globally, it's about 3.6%. So one has an immediate, what shall we say, arresting statistic there. How come it's generated so many headlines and influences so many elections and stirs so many passions when statistically it's not that big a problem? And some of my colleagues, I call them cautious optimists in the piece, and they're good friends, and I don't want to, as it were, tear them down. They regard this as the key statistic and say, well, in the end, what will happen is fertility levels will drop to such a level, and the recognition that we need people from abroad to service various holes in our labour market, those realities will show through, and there's just, if you like, a gap between our current crisis in public imagination and the ultimate reality that we'll all have to adjust to reasonable levels of international migration. Now, I challenge that cautious optimism, not because I want to fall out with my chums, but I think they've just been a little bit too optimistic. I do think there are some grounds for concern, some rational and some irrational. So just to allude to the rational grounds, for instance, we do know that the level of displacement is extremely high, particularly that wrought by conflict. The level of displacement by climate-related events is also high, although curiously it doesn't show up enormously in international migration figures yet. But there's no doubt that this is a coiled spring, and ultimately it may show up quite significantly. Then if we look at the World Values Survey, a statistical survey, a social science survey that's been done in 49 countries, there are very high levels of anxiety about the violence that is wrought by international migration. And then you might ultimately say, well, there is an enormous discrepancy between different demographic reality, fertility rates in particular. And the most notable contrast is, if you take Southern Europe, say a place like Spain, where reproduction rate is about 1.2, it needs to be 2.1 to reproduce the population reliably. And the other end, one of the highest in the world, Nigeria, 4.6 million people. Now you think, oh, well, what's one got to do with the other? I ask you to think of the Trans-Sahara Highway, which is gradually being built and is now 90% complete. So can one imagine a two-wheel drive from Lagos to Algiers? And already we're beginning to see significant numbers of Africans held up in North Africa, in Tunisia, in Libya, in Morocco. And so that's a very interesting one to watch. But the irrational part of this is perhaps the most interesting. And I want to allude here to a 1928 theorem, as it was called. It's not really a theorem, but let's say for the purposes of rhetoric, it's not bad to call it a theorem, advanced by a sociologist called Thomas and his wife Dorothy Thomas, who doesn't get the credit. So the Thomas and Thomas theorem I've changed it to. And what the theorem says is what's real in the mind is real in its consequences. And it's an interesting idea because you can see it playing out in front of us. Just to move off the international migration theme for a moment and turn to something like knife crime. Knife crime historically has been quite low, but if people believe knife crime is a serious threat, they will arm themselves with knives and then increase the probability that knife crime will go up. And equally, in the case of international migration, although the number of international migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, whatever category you want to use, who go out murdering people is really quite small, the fear of that is quite large, and thus protests outside hotels, angry people, people voting for right-wing parties or for populist leaders pretty well throughout the world. Not throughout the world, that would be an exaggeration, but in at least 8 or 9 significant countries. So we then have this sort of very interesting problem of how do we close that gap? Do we just wait for it to play itself out? Or are there ways in which one could mitigate these fears, rational and irrational, and somehow manage public policy in such a way as it avoids performance and actually does something useful? Now, at the moment, we're at the level of performance, and you can see this play out in a number of countries. The one that is one that struck me as notable is when President Trump opened a detention center in Florida, which was known as Alligator Alcatraz. And he paraded up and down, showing how nasty he could be to detainees. Now, interestingly enough, here's a very fascinating bit of research done by a Norwegian scientist, a social scientist called Jürgen Carling. He and his team interviewed 19,000 intending migrants in 23 destinations worldwide. And the Americans have thought the key to deter migration is to put out these messages of anger and hostility, showing migrants in shackles, Trump wandering around Alcatraz, barbed wire going up on defensive. And when actually asked, the migrants responded by saying, well, that's not me, I'm much smarter than that, I'll never get caught, or if those things come into being, I better hurry and get there fast before it all happens. So the response didn't match the message. And this is a constant theme, I think, that if you want policies to work, you must try to make them work for the people for whom they are directed. So our policy is constructed between the politician and the long-settled population, and particularly the electorate. And that's the transaction. But where are the social actors? Where are the migrants in that calculation? Who's spoken to them? What do they want? How do they aspire, think, dream, and so on? And they're much less predictable than is assumed. And I don't have time to go into all of it, but there's no doubt that many migrants would be content with short migration training contracts. Not all of them want to become citizens. Not all of them certainly want to wander around killing and raping young girls. So there is an element of unreality because you don't actually talk to the people themselves. And so a lot of what might work is to enter into some kind of transaction with the social actors rather than avoid that transaction. Well, I can say more in the discussion, but I think I've used my time up already, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robin. And next speaker, Professor Gabriel Stylianidis, is a professor of mathematical education. And again, actually, I thought his subtitles chapter in the book was quite relevant for the whole session this evening. He's called it Education as a Distinct Science, Challenging Common Sense in Teaching and Policy. And again, I think that's another way of describing why social sciences is necessary, because common sense and the appearance of things aren't necessarily correct, true, or useful. And indeed, that applies more generally with medical sciences as well. And the common sense answers things may actually be more complex than the common sense answers would lead you to believe. So, Gabriel.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction and also for organizing this event at Kellogg College and for the opportunity to contribute to this conversation about the importance of social sciences. So, as Jonathan mentioned, I'm Professor of Mathematics Education at the Department of Education here at Oxford and also a Fellow of Worcester College. I've been in Oxford since 2010, And before that, I spent 9 years in the States, and originally I'm from Cyprus. My research focuses on fundamental mathematical practices that are important for all students learning of mathematics, such as mathematical reasoning, proving, problem solving, and problem posing. And in particular about designing and scaling up interventions to help students overcome certain difficulties or misconceptions they have in this area. So the chapter that Jonathan mentioned earlier, which I'm going to talk to you about today, is co-authored with Andreas Stylianidis, who is a professor of mathematics education at the Faculty of Education at Cambridge. And with Andreas, we share a bit more than the same surname, the same job title, albeit at rival institutions. We are twin brothers, in case anybody is wondering, just to preempt a possible question. So our chapter focuses on an important discipline that everyone feels familiar with, but is often misunderstood: education. And the central point I'm going to make today in these 5 minutes is rather simple. Education is a distinct social science, rigorous, theory-building, and evidence-generating, not a collection of commonsensical ideas about teaching. So now you may wonder about why education is often misunderstood. Almost everyone, and many of us, almost everyone have been through education, and also many of us have helped our children at home with their homework. So it's easy to assume that we already understand teaching and learning. So this creates what Lorty termed a couple of decades ago as the apprenticeship of observation. Thousands of hours watching teachers and believing that these observations qualify us to judge what teaching is or how educational systems should work. And this is where many misconceptions emerge: that good teaching is intuitive, that subject experts automatically make good teachers, that educational policy can be shaped purely by ideology or personal experience. So these assumptions feel right, but they are often wrong, and frequently they are also damaging. So let's consider an example also discussed in the chapter regarding how educational research can overturn common sense. For decades, there was this common belief, which was also held by major policy organizations, that the more advanced mathematics courses teachers took at the university, the more effective they would be in their teaching work. So this sounds logical, it's also intuitive, but it's also wrong. Research, and this goes back to the 70s, showed that taking more advanced mathematics courses often had no positive effect on student learning, and also sometimes it had a negative effect on student learning. Why is that? Because, as we now know, this highly abstract and compact mathematical knowledge that is the focus of university mathematics courses is not the most important knowledge that teachers need in order to become good teachers and support their students' learning of mathematics. What really matters is something different, which we call pedagogically functional mathematical knowledge. So this includes the mathematical understandings that allow, among other things, the teachers to anticipate misconception, interpret their students' ideas, represent concepts in ways that are not only mathematically appropriate, but also accessible to their own students. So this idea emerged not from ideology or common sense, but from rigorous social science research. Theory development, mixed method studies, validated measurement tools, large-scale statistical analysis. So research has shown that this specialized mathematical knowledge predicts student learning independent of socioeconomic status or general teaching experience. So through such educational research, we moved from a common sense belief to a refined, empirically validated conceptualization of what teachers need to know to be effective in their work. And this conceptualization has transformed teacher education internationally. But education is not only about identifying or describing problems, it's also about designing solutions. A powerful example that we discuss in the chapter is about a curriculum intervention on fractions. So researchers didn't simply describe the misconceptions and difficulties that students have in this area, which arguably are a lot, but they went a step further to design and test a lesson sequence, collaborated with teachers, iteratively refined the lessons, and then demonstrated through rigorous evaluation design that the intervention improved learning for students across the achievement spectrum. So this kind of work is characteristic of education as a social science, theory-informed design, classroom-based experimentation, systematic evaluation, and a commitment to practical and scalable impact. So the final question I will briefly touch on is, why does this matter now? When we think about the broader crisis we're facing today, some of which have already been mentioned by the previous speakers and many more undiscussed in the book, may those related to AI, to climate change, to migration, to inequality, to mental health, education is woven through all of them. Educational systems determine who benefits from innovation, who participates in governance, how societies respond to inequality, and how well people understand the world around them. So if we rely on common sense, we risk misunderstanding the very systems that shape our societal futures. So education can transform lives, but only when it is guided by rigorous scientific evidence rather than anecdotes. So to conclude, educational phenomena are simply far too important to be left to anecdotes or intuition or commonsensical approaches. It's important that we trust and support the specialist science to do its job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, and actually, Gabrielle added on that additional point about social sciences and math and natural sciences, that not only we do need the whole spectrum of these topics, but even when we're looking at maths and engineering and medical sciences and how to deliver those, we need to make sure they're taught effectively and well, and that requires a social science of education to think through. Now, I do have a chapter in this book myself on economics and the global financial crisis, how we can try and avoid these things in the future. And I go through the work that social scientists have done successfully in developing the sorts of regulations and governance that can prevent financial crises, which can be devastating for population of the world, most obviously in the 1930s, when the global depression led to the rise of the Nazis in Germany and so on. Interestingly, the global financial crisis of 10 years ago was averted partly because governments throughout the world explicitly acknowledged that danger and therefore implemented quite rapidly a lot of the sort of policies social scientists had developed, which had been rowed back under pressure from those who could make more money from those regulations being diluted. But one additional point to make in the chapter is relevant to our next speaker, which is that the more diverse the economy is, rather than having all companies of the same shareholder-owned type, which not only tend to generate the sort of processes that lead to financial crises, but then when you have an economic crisis, they all operate in the same way and amplify the destruction. If you've got a more diversified economy with some public ownership, national and local, and companies owned by their employees, their customers, the local communities, and so on, these organizations not only tend not to cause economic crises, but when economic crises hit, they don't act in the same way, and they act as a buffer to minimize the economic and social disruption caused. And a final speaker, Professor Marya Besharov, is the academic director of the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship, as well as being professor of organizations and impact. And exactly the same points I've just been making apply to social enterprises. In Marya's chapter, she tends to look at, and indeed the Skoll Center, the benefits that these organizations bring to the economy, society, individuals, and so on. But on top of all those benefits, they also have the added benefit of minimizing the disruption and harm that economic crises do to both the economy and society and individuals. So, Marya.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, for including me in the book and including me in the discussion this evening. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the chapter that I co-authored with Catherine Hasted, who's the deputy director at the Skoll Center. And just a bit of background on myself. Jonathan shared a little bit about the work we do at the Skoll Center. I'm trained as an organization theorist with a sort of rooting in sociology. And that's sort of the lens that I bring to my work and to the chapter. I lead the Skoll Center. I'm on the faculty at the business school, as Jonathan noted. I've been here about 5.5 years, and I was previously at Cornell University in upstate New York, sitting in a labor school, but studying issues of sort of management and labor relations in addition to social entrepreneurship. And so those ideas very much infuse the chapter that I wrote with Catherine. And our starting point really in the chapter, as well as in the work we do at the Skoll Center and in my own research, which is very connected to that, is really about trying to understand and articulate the ways in which perspectives and theories and empirical research from organization and management studies can help us better understand and address complex social challenges. And then I'll pick up a little bit where you left off in terms of the interconnections, right? And you talked about education as sort of being woven through what are possible ways of dealing with some of the complex crises that we face. And so that's our starting point in the chapter, is sort of the complex and interconnected societal problems that we all face around climate and environment, around pandemics and public health, around inequality and poverty, around technology and AI. And really, there are two features of those kinds of complex societal challenges that we feel make them particularly, or make the social sciences that we talk about in the chapter particularly important and useful. And one is that there's a lot of interdependence across different elements, social, economic, political, natural, and physical, as well, cultural. None of these are isolated problems just sitting in one of those spheres. And they also are both global and local problems in the sense that they are issues that we face around the world, but what they look like, how they show up, why they're happening, and what we need to do to address them is not uniform across all contexts or all communities. And so what we suggest in the chapter is that there are three pieces or lenses from organization and management theory that can be particularly useful in understanding it from a scholarly sense, but also working with people in the field to help address these kinds of problems. And we start at the quite macro level and talk about systems perspectives. And systems perspectives have a long history, not just in the social sciences, also in the natural sciences, but we really draw on work as systems perspectives came into the social sciences, really starting in the 1950s and on to today. And we talk about a few key aspects of systems perspectives that make them useful. I mean, often we use the term systems rather casually, but if we look at sort of conceptually what's going on there are three parts that are really important. One, systems perspectives highlight interdependence and sort of multi-causality, and they shift us from a linear mode to a much more complex mode of multi-causality and interdependence and non-linearity. Doesn't come naturally, right? Again, to your point about sort of the common sense approach, this isn't how we're trained to think most of the time, but this is very much how the world often operates in the social world, of course, as well as in the natural world. The other is that they are sort of multi-level and multi-element systems, perspectives attune us to that again, we're thinking about aspects of the physical world, we're thinking about cultural norms and beliefs, we're thinking about political systems. All of these we need to take into account. We can't just box one off from the other. And then the most important perhaps is that systems perspectives help us understand and attune to that outcomes are emergent properties of these interconnections, right? And so we need to look at all those pieces together and how they morph and change and evolve as they influence one another over time, and think about what is that producing, both intended and unintended, at the system level, and how might we think to shift what are today's emergent properties that are deeply problematic in some arenas, for example. So that's where we start, at this sort of very macro level, and the challenge, of course, is what do you do with that, right? Because that's a sort of a much more complex view of the world, and there's a reason why it hasn't been sort of quite as taken up as we might have hoped in research or in practice. And actually, right before I came here, I was on a call with a group of partners in a large professional services firm who work on sustainability, and we've worked with them now for several months, and they get it up here, but taking that into their work with large firms who are, even when they are really trying to do things right, the default is the more linear sort of find me a cause effect relationship, and so it's really hard to do this in practice. But we need to be working with people on that and drawing from these perspectives. The second perspective that we talk about in the chapter is really the area where I've done the most of my own work, which is on what we call in the organization studies world hybridity. And by hybridity, we mean the mixing of different institutional systems, different belief systems, different views about what's the right kind of objective and what's the right means to get to that end within a single organization. And social enterprises, which Jonathan mentioned, are sort of the classic example of this, where these are ventures that are pursuing or trying to address a social or environmental issue through a business venture. And so they're mixing the world of commercial activity in the market with the world of social welfare and planetary and societal flourishing. And so they embed, in a sense, contradiction. But in fact, what the research suggests about hybridity is that, yes, it's sort of can be a source of contradiction and tension, but it also is a source of innovation and creativity. And so there's a rich body of work looking at how organizations that are trying to address these societal challenges can harness those tensions and conflicts between the two different institutional spheres that they're bringing together. And so we unpack in the chapter what are some of the core practices that we can learn from the research on these hybrid organizations that can help leaders working to address these complex problems to really make progress and to harness, again, those potentially destructive but also potentially creative and generative tensions. And just to sort of preview there, because that's really sort of the heart of it, there's a real a powerful message that comes out of the research around the importance of thinking in a both and rather than an either or way. And you can probably see the links to the notion of sort of multi-causal and interdependent in the systems perspective, but a need to sort of say, how can we bring together X and Y rather than talk about X versus Y? And how can we harness the power of business and the wisdom of local communities and activists, for example? But we need to do that within boundaries. And so another core insight from this work is, how do we build what we call guardrails, or really structures, roles, and relationships that create accountability for the ultimate problems that we're trying to address in the communities that we're trying to help. And then the third key piece that comes out of this work on hybridity is really how do we experiment and innovate and adapt over time and get rid of the rigidity that often sets in organizations as they grow in scale and in age, and maintain some of that flexibility and that experimentation approach that comes naturally in the early stages of an organization, but often gets rooted out over time. And so then I'll just say one last piece, which is the third lens that we draw on, is really an area where Catherine, my co-author, has built up her expertise, which is what's called relational working. And so we're sort of moving from the systems level to the organization level, really to the individual and interpersonal level. And the key insight that comes out of the relational working research is that we can build up in an individual and in a group the capacity to work across different perspectives, different bases of expertise, and to really harness that diversity of perspective and expertise to collectively work towards change. And the message that I'll leave you with is that the way in which that's done, and so really taking sort of the systems perspective, the hybrid organizing into the action of relational working, the way in which that's done is by bridging research and practice. And so that even the research on relational working has been done in partnership between researchers and practitioners. We provide two examples of what this could look like and has looked like in the chapter with an organization that Catherine had spent some time studying and working with, and one that I had spent some time studying and working with. But I'll just leave you with an example of how this works and what we do at the Skoll Center, because it really very much is core and has become even more core to how we do our work, which is a lot of what we're doing now is bringing our research into conversation with practice through the notion of a learning lab. And the idea of the learning labs is that we're taking the research on systems, we're taking the research on hybridity and relational working, and we're partnering with different kinds of organizations that are addressing a particular systemic challenge and helping them grasp these insights that I've shared with you at a high level, take that into their practice, but also learning from them and feeding back into the research about, well, what does it really take to do this on the ground? And how does that shift our understanding of relational working or shift our understanding of some of those leadership practices I talked about for managing hybridity and fostering productive rather than destructive tension. And so what I would leave you with is just the encouragement, sort of why the social sciences matter, and in this case, sort of how they can help address complex social problems is it's really by building those bridges and taking the connections and the insights that come out of different streams of research. In this case, I've talked about organization and management studies research, but bringing those in conversation with practitioners. And I think that's sort of a theme that we've heard through all of our comments. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed, Marya, and thank you to all four speakers. I thought all four were incredibly thoughtful and helpful and fascinating. So throw it open to the floor to you for any questions, comments, observations. Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on something you mentioned, Jonathan, as you were doing some of the introductions. So you mentioned that employee-owned companies often help communities. And I just wanted to point the audience toward a particular resource that would help people find out more about this if they were interested. So at Rutgers, as you know, there's a center on employee ownership and profit sharing. And as part of that center, they have a particular online library called CLIO, which is the Curriculum Library for Employee Ownership. And if one puts community and resilience into their search engine, you can find some incredible research that shows how employee ownership can even save communities, especially smaller communities where if businesses are going to be bought by private equity, for example, those factories are going to be likely shut down. But if the employees own those companies instead, those businesses survive and the communities survive. So thank you for mentioning that.
Great. Thank you very much. Any other comments, questions? Yeah.
You all spoke you all spoke very compellingly about how social sciences can tackle the issues that we're facing in society, but I'm familiar with the book, and I know that it also shows how social sciences can identify opportunities to better society. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to the kind of new opportunities that can be identified by social sciences in your areas.
Thank you. Who wants to pick up on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, I would say, so we work with a lot of social entrepreneurs and social innovators. And of course, some of them are coming from a sort of a problem framing, right? But many are very much coming from an opportunity framing. And I would say is sort of the research that is in our space from organization and management studies is sort of pivotal to helping them take like an amazing kernel of an idea or an innovation and take it to scale, right? And because they need, like, they've got the innovation, but we have the research on, okay, well, what does it take to bring that globally when you've developed it for this particular market? And what do you need to be sensitized to about what should stay the same and what should change? And so it's sort of taking innovation and bringing it to scale. I think there's a real opportunity there from organization and management studies to contribute.
Thank you. That's a very good question. We all mentioned or touched upon different challenges that we face today, or crises, about AI, about the pandemic, about migration. So all of those challenges require citizens who are able to engage productively, problem solve, and understand not only the problems but also solutions. And in that space, education has a major role to play in cultivating citizens who will be able to productively engage with those challenges.
Yeah, thanks, and a good question again. And let me just say that, like the others, I think a lot of our narrative has been taken over by people who see crises and problems. And that's certainly true of the international migration sphere. But we know historically that one of the great sources of innovation in business, science, culture, come from immigrants for all kinds of complex reasons, but basically because they're viewing things without the taken for granted assumptions of the local people. And they're able, therefore, to produce all kinds of scientific and other advances. But more than that, one can say something much more positive about the capacity of people to relate and interconnect with each other. Ultimately, that's what we're trying to do here, to create, as Will Hutton said, the we society, or an international society in which we can get on with each other. Now, international migration offers that opportunity. We can begin to understand each other, learn, dialogue, create some basis of understanding of mutual help. And in some small areas, that's exactly what's happening. So the Spanish village or the Italian town that's collapsing, the school that's closing down, without immigrants, that would disappear. And so suddenly, instead of being the problem, they are a solution. And that's the way to see, I think, a lot of these issues.
Thank you. Again, thank you for the question. So I think from my perspective, one of the most immediate things that I want my work to generate is in higher education is a more diverse, a richer range of materials that we can teach our students. Because I think that will, one, help them to continue to engage with their studies, but also prepare them in a different way to go out into the wider world. Beyond higher education, I think in terms of regional organizations such as the European Union, it will encourage thinking, I think somebody's already mentioned it, thinking differently about the way to engage with the rest of the world. And I think that's something that is quite urgent to do at the current juncture, where we see anti-democratic leaders working together to take international organizations in a different direction, if not destroy them completely, but also to start to build different types of relationships with the global south and put us in a different position to develop the the networks of sustainability that will help us as well as them as a we to create, this green world that we want to live in, that isn't destroying the environment, that isn't encouraging destruction of natural resources, but we are thinking collectively across the world about how to maintain these resources that we all need for our everyday existence.
Great, thank you very much. And actually, your comments at the end there segue into a sort of related question, which I thought maybe you're going to ask, which is about what we as social scientists should be doing to put our own house in order, if you like. Because clearly we've got a responsibility, to the outside world to make the point about how important social sciences is, because without that, we'd all be in serious danger, and we want to get the best students, the best academics. We want government to be supportive and funding agencies to be supportive and fund social science research and so on. But as social scientists, we do need to look at our own disciplines and think how they can improve. I mean, you just commented on law, but I must admit I'm from economics, which it's got a lot to answer for. We can certainly got to put our own house in order. We've also then got to think about how our social sciences disciplines can work better together within social sciences. And then thirdly, we've got to think about how social science as a whole can communicate and work better with the natural sciences and the humanities. So I think, we all need to be doing both those jobs at the same time, putting our own house in order, developing the social sciences and communicating the importance. But any other questions? Yeah, at the back.
Thank you very much for your fascinating sharing. And my question is, as academics, what kind of transformations in the research system that, like the research culture for engagement and impacts, or the collaboration and subordination across the disciplines, and the entangled relationality between the human and the non-human, that you, as the social sciences researchers, can empower in the currently the neoliberal and anthropocentric Western paradigm modern universities? Thank you very much.
Wow, that's a good question. And while you're thinking about that, let's. Did you want to ask a question as well? And we can take them both, and people, maybe one or two, can reflect on each.
Mine is going to sound very dumb in comparison, but I was going to ask for each of your disciplinary focuses how you see technological advances as like furthering or providing a barrier or new challenges for the aims that you have in your specialties.
Great. Does someone want to pick up on either of those questions?
So I can say a little bit about technology in law, because this is something we're grappling with at the moment. I mean, in a positive way and a negative way. So of course, not just law, but everybody is grappling with ChatGPT and AI. That's kind of out there. That's probably not the most interesting thing to talk about anymore. But in law firms, they're actually embracing artificial intelligence. A lot to do much of the repetitive work that interns would normally do, which is good because it increases efficiency, but it also releases interns to do some more interesting work. Or in an ideal world, that's what it would do. They wouldn't take fewer interns, but they would take the same number of interns, but give them more interesting work to do. In terms of legal practice, it's also changing the way in which you can access justice and deliver justice. So I sit on a very small tribunal, and we now conduct our hearings online. So technology has enabled that. We no longer have to travel to different locations. That enables us to to deal with more appeals more rapidly. So again, it improves the efficiency in the delivery of justice. And then the third way I was going to mention, which has just now completely gone out of my mind, I'll come back to that.
Yes, I mean, I'm just going to add something not in my field of migration on technology. It seems to me that the key issue here is ownership. And if we've got these titans in charge of our technological future, a number of whom have very dubious political opinions, sometimes associated with their own ego, sometimes associated with right-wing fascist causes, and with fantasy worlds that they're constructing with themselves, I think we do have something serious to worry about. And my feeling about technology is I really don't mind however many innovations come along, but I think there should be a sense of public ownership of those facilities, not just regulation, because I don't think that quite goes far enough, in my opinion. I think we should own them, they should be deconstructed, they should be controlled by communities and people at the base, not by these 5 or 6 individuals who have wealth of such unimaginable and power that I think they're dangerous.
Going back to something I said earlier, that it is part of the mission of education to prepare citizens to function into today's and tomorrow's society. And these great advancements in artificial intelligence, which is becoming part of our lives, is part of that society and cannot be ignored. And this can have wide-ranging implications about how we educate our students, and also what aspects of their learning are becoming more or less important. So one example from my field in mathematics education is that traditionally our focus in the area of argumentation and proof was to help students generate, construct their own arguments. Now it's very easy to pose the question to ChatGPT, for example, and ask to produce an argument and proof about a particular statement. What becomes more important now is to be able to evaluate, comprehend, and assess the output that you get from that. So the proof evaluation, proof comprehension competencies are becoming more important, and the proof construction is becoming a bit less important than we viewed in the past. So this is just one example about how the skills that students will need are changing in this context.
Okay, I'll try to tackle a bit of the first question that we heard and link to some of what Jonathan was saying. I think one thing that we really try to do at the School Center, and I would say more broadly across a lot of work and training programs or DPhil programs in organization and management studies, is really to sort of bridge the rigor relevance divide. And I think this is part of getting our own house in order, right? Which is, we need to be very mindful of not abandoning the sort of really important scholarly process and rigorous theorizing that we do and that we really have developed as a real strength. But we need to marry that with the sort of practical application, the grounding in real world problems. And again, this is one of those we need to shift from either or to both and, that we often have DPhil programs and even sort of schools and institutions that are known for more of one and the other, and we need to blend those. And I think this speaks to sort of how do we develop the students who become the scholars and the leaders of tomorrow, who will both excel in advancing knowledge, but really use that knowledge in ways that matter for the world in addressing problems, but also, to your point, in really finding sources of innovation and sort of the positive and the creativity side. And I it's really hard to do, right? We're sort of much more comfortable in one world or the other. And one of the things we're really trying to do at the School Center is to support junior researchers, starting from the DPhil stage, but certainly postdocs and early career scholars, to help them work across those boundaries. And partly that's bringing in people, and we've done some of this with Jonathan, through the continuing ed program, to bring in people who have deep expertise in practice, who then want to come and bring that into the academy and to be studying for their DPhil. And it's also helping those who are more grounded on the scholarly side to engage with the partner institutions that we work with to sort of get out in the, and as you said, right, we need to be talking to people sort of on the ground, experiencing and living the phenomenon and bringing that into our research.
Yeah, great. And it's important to remember, I think, that the University of Oxford as an institution is completely committed to the sort of principles you talk about. And a graduation, when students graduate, whatever they're graduating with, whether it's medical sciences or maths or anything else, they're told at the graduation ceremony by the Vice Chancellor that their degree signifies two things. One, that they've been taught and tested on certain specific skills, and the Vice Chancellor says indeed the Latin being used to bestow your degree refers to them as licenses to do certain things. But even more important, the students are told, is what they do with that knowledge, that is more important. They must get out there and improve the world, but also that the degree courses are designed in Oxford to teach people how to learn, how to apply what they've learned in a suitably innovative and imaginative way, and so on. So I think it's very important that we, keep building on those principles. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thanks for the panel. Very interesting. I wanted to ask what advice you have for kind of early career people on specialization, because doing rigorous social science sort of encourages people to specialize a lot on methodologies and theoretical backgrounds, and that creates highly siloed knowledge with sort of epistemic barriers between disciplines, and how, that encourages people to, everything, if you're a hammer, everything's a nail, that kind of thinking, and how you overcome that to see these things in the sort of emergent way that they actually are. Thank you.
You want to pass that?
Thank you. So, very good question. When I did my doctorate in European Union law, we were expected to be generalists, but as the scope of European Union law has expanded exponentially, then more and more students are now specialists in one area. I think there's still a lot of value in being both, and I think that just because you spend a significant portion at an important time of your life focusing on one particular area doesn't mean that you shouldn't then broaden your perspective after your PhD to look at other areas. And I think lots of employers appreciate that as well, because to an extent, if you want an academic career, when you do take an academic post, then you will be seen as having greater value if you can offer more than just your specialism. Specialism is important, but it's not the be-all and end-all, because this is what we're trying to say across the social sciences. We actually want to be able to build bridges. So the ability to show that you think beyond your specialism and you are thinking about how you can build bridges with other disciplines will be an important skill to demonstrate. And if I can just take a little bit longer to go back to the first question, I remembered what I wanted to say, and it was that in Spain, they are now using technology to deliver judgments. So there is no human intervention. The issue is sent to a server, I don't know where, but there are now decisions being produced using AI completely, not across, not in criminal law or family law or anything like that. I actually have I think it's Spain. We can talk about it afterwards, but I'm sure it's Spain. It's not across all of law, but this is something that can be done now for a specific case, specific cohort of cases. One of the downsides, I think that our colleagues who are working hard to help us to understand AI need to think about is how it impacts upon our attempts in other places to promote diversity in the curriculum. We spend a lot of time trying to encourage our students to read beyond, the white male scholar in the north, but AI puts them back there, and that is a huge disadvantage to creating a more open learning environment, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to add something to the last question. As we as a scientific community progress, we develop vast amounts of knowledge, and this means that the new problems that we need to face are becoming more complicated problems. And most of these problems, to be appropriately addressed, they require this kind of multidisciplinary perspectives or cross-disciplinary collaborations, which goes beyond the social sciences. So my recommendation would be to seek problems that lie at the intersections of different disciplines. And this is sometimes not easy to pursue. One way in which we try to facilitate that in my department and Department of Education is by having 2 supervisors for each doctoral student. And actually, Jonathan and I are co-supervising together a student who is interested in game theory in economics and education. And the fact that it allows the student to pursue his work is by capitalizing on our expertise in these different fields.
Great. Yep. Thank you for that second bite.
So this is a question for the professor sitting on the left and the professor sitting on the right. I want to go back to the decolonialization component of what you started talking about and link it to technology and identification. And I heard you say very clearly that you were concerned with EU-related things. But I just wanted to comment briefly and then get a comment back from you. If I were to say that in India, among people who really think seriously about poverty, the identification system they've brought in there has been an incredible benefit to helping overcome corruption that would have otherwise taken away from the ability for poor people to get the resources they needed. And so when I think about the Global South, which is where I've specialized, I'd love to see technology linking up with social sciences to build something that's working. Now, some people say because they don't like Modi that the identification system hasn't been as good as I think it's been, but I've worked mostly with Indians here at Oxford, and the intelligentsia is excited about the results there. And I wanted to then link back over to the right side of the panel and make the connection to business, because so often when we think about social science and technology, my personal opinion is that business is the bridge between those two. And somehow often business gets almost linked in with the bad parts of technology and dismissed. And so I hope that both of you would just comment on what I said.
Thank you.
Sure, so I'll comment on that and reflect on that last part. I mean, business is complex, right? It's one word, there's lots in there, right? And, we talk about the big tech firms and AI and the concerns there and the concerns about motivation. There's a huge, businesses can be part of the problem and part of the solution. And, I think we need to be open to that and to see both sides of it, not just one side. Certainly we engage, and this is a huge part of why I came to join the faculty at Oxford, was the opportunity to engage with businesses who were really interested in being part of the solution. And we have to recognize they're in a complex and conflicted spot, right? And so the professional services firm I mentioned earlier, they can't ignore, all of their partners are reminded weekly of where they are in terms of the revenue that they've brought in, and they're all thinking about billable hours. They can't not think about that. And if they're going to sell an engagement, they have to somehow meet the client where the client is. But they know in their hearts they need to help the clients see we need to transform your whole industry, right? And we need to rethink your business model. And that's maybe not going to show up this quarter, next quarter, this year, even next year in your business performance. And so it's complicated for them, right? But they're the people that we need to be engaging with, in my view, and helping. Because, you know, they're at a leverage point where they can create huge change, but they can't get there by themselves. And and that's where I think we have an obligation almost to sort of bring the insights from social science and not be purists and say we can't engage here.
Thank you. I would agree with that. I think technology has advantages and disadvantages, and I mentioned both. You know, there are advantages for the efficiency of justice, but there are disadvantages for undermining diversity in the curriculum in the global north. When we think about the global south, then yes, of course, you can see how technology has really been used positively to improve the quality of life, especially for women, in terms of pay systems, in terms of being able to develop and grow a business in rural areas, in terms of the creation of call centers, even in terms of remote teaching. So there are good, you know, we have to take the look at both sides, but I very much want us to look at both sides and not just think that all the answers to all of the complex problems we've mentioned can be solved with technology. We also very much have to think about ownership and regulation of technology. We need to think about how we do respond when things go wrong because of technology. You know, there are still huge questions around, for example, liability in the use of artificial intelligence in the health service, in labour law, driverless cars. These are all very important questions, and it comes back almost to the very big question that was asked by the lady at the back. This is really very much changing the way in which we all relate to each other and the way we relate to things and the way we make things. And we're not thinking about it in a connected way. And that brings us back to why the social sciences are important, not just across the social sciences, but across the social and the natural sciences.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I would say that technology, it's always been the same. Technology by itself is neither good nor bad. It depends who uses it and for what purposes, and that comes down to social sciences, including the recognition software. I agree completely. It could be used for good purposes and done well, but it can equally be used, you know, poorly. I mean, if you think of facial recognition, okay, if a police force has got it, that's great. They can use it to identify people at events, but you've got to ask, do they use it at all events, or just some events and not others? And then what are the difference between those events, et cetera, et cetera? But these are all social science questions. Okay, well, we should give you the opportunity to talk separately to the speakers, because I'm pleased to say they've all agreed to stay on and mingle and have a drink and sign copies of the book if you want your individual chapters signed. But please first, and there are drinks at the back for everybody, but first join me in thanking all four speakers. Thank you.